right. Well, thanks everybody for those who was able to join today. We're going to go through some real testing use cases and last minute must-haves features that relate to the one-to-one regulation. It's coming out in 5 days, as I'm sure everybody on this call realizes. So today we're going to cover two primary parts. One is going to be testing both vendors and partners and talking about that. And then the second part will be utilizing the form builder of Boberdoo. So as those are still working on custom forms, the form builder can be a bridge or short-term solution so that you can quickly get a form up while you're working on those longer-term custom forms. So to get started today, we're going to be looking into some Boberdoo systems here. We're going to start with vendor testing. So we have Michael and Jake from Boberdoo that are on the call with us here as well today. Hey Jake, hey Michael, how you doing?
Awesome. Beautiful morning.
Good. So I know you guys have talked with a lot of clients through tickets, emails, calls about vendor testing. Do you guys have any thoughts about where most clients, is there any most situations here where clients are dealing with setting up sources and vendors? Any questions around that you see?
Well, at least from my view, I think a lot of our clients are currently facing the testing process. A lot of API specs have been exchanged at this stage, and implementation is ongoing, and then I think testing is probably going to get hot and heavy here if it hasn't already. So I think this is really a well-timed topic to go into. So,
yeah, absolutely. So when you look at like vendor testing, for example, we will see our clients typically divvy those up into two categories. So I'll go into a lead system here, and we will go into the source vendor settings. As you've seen in our previous content and webinars, we really encourage people to set up new sources for the one-to-one flow. It does make things easier from an organizational standpoint, and we have a nice wizard to do that. So there's an option specifically for dynamic consent in the wizard. And so when we look at the wizard questions, this is really where we see kind of the first line of demarcation here, which would be whether you're an internal source that you're setting up from your own websites that you're driving traffic to, or whether this is a source of a third-party vendor. And so that's kind of the first case. When we look at an internal source, we have options that we're going to take a look at in the feature section that you may want to consider. Things like ignore profit margin. We'll cover that here in a second. But the idea here is with an internal source, presumably you're going to want to capture all or as many of those leads that are legitimate as possible. Whereas when you're dealing with a third-party vendor, this should be more calculation based off of your current demand. So when we look at the next big question is exclusive versus shared scenarios for how many selling companies to display. As an internal source, right, Jake, if you're running traffic to your landing page, you know how you have that coded, what your business decisions are, and so you know what this is. If you're dealing with exclusive only, obviously leave that at 1. But if you are working in shared scenarios, you know whether this is 5 or 3 or 4, that number there. But when you're dealing with a third-party vendor, right, that is an unknown. You don't know, presumably, unless you have gone through their path, what they are, what their website is set up for. So That's been a big kind of question that I've seen in a bunch of tickets. I think you've mentioned that before as well. If you're only dealing with exclusive, mark this at 1, but also it's important to tell your vendors that so that you or your vendors to communicate that to you, so that you can align that. If your vendor is only going to display an exclusive match and you set this to 4, not knowing they're only going to display exclusive, your boberdoo system is going to build your best scenario up to 4 companies. But your vendor is only going to take one of those and display that to the consumer. And so when you align the maximum companies to what is actually happening on that landing page, this ensures that you're always going to then return your best single match, the best price presumably, back to the vendor. The other thing would be labels. Labels are something a lot of people use with partners, but source labels can help from an organizational standpoint when you're dealing with internal or external and one-to-one versus non-to-one-to-one. Maybe you guys could talk a little bit about the ping timeout. It's something I know we've gotten a lot of questions on. Ping timeout, post timeout, and then our favorite horribly named internal switch that is, what's that called there when it's the difference between the two?
Processing timeout is what I always refer to it as. I guess
the delay, right?
Depends on how you want to think of it. But yeah, you're highlighting the 3 that really have come to the surface of these timeouts with this one-to-one consent. A lot of people just really didn't pay attention to those timeouts until now. Because of all the processing that's happening on so many different parties' side, suddenly these become a pretty big deal. We've been getting a lot of requests to increase what would be the processing timeout, or the amount of time for the overall transaction to transpire. But the ping and the post are ones that you as a user can control in the source. It's that third one that is something that is done currently on the back end, but given the number of requests we're getting, I would imagine in a future release we might make that client facing. I don't know, maybe I'm getting out of line with that suggestion.
No, yeah, that's something that we have talked about internally. The ping timeout, right, that is how long your system has to build a bid and return that back in the response. So this would be something that's typically driven by the source that you're setting up, either your own website, and so you know how long you want that consumer to wait, or from your vendors who then give you that information. I need this ping processed in 10 seconds or something like that. Speaking more to what you had talked about, Michael, that thing we refer to internally as the delay, the max delay between a ping and a post. It is an internal system switch, but it is configurable. So the default is 5 minutes, meaning that if there is no post within 5 minutes, that ping will expire. So we release that scenario back, but that is something that we can extend. We have done it for many clients, 10 or 15 minutes. The one thing to consider there is that who your buyers are and how long you want to lock up that ping scenario. So if you are pinging out to buyers who are dynamically bidding on that lead, you want to make sure you communicate that delay to them, because if their ping expires and you go to post the lead, you're going to get an error. And then the other consideration when it comes to that maximum delay is low limit buyers. So if you're dealing with a lot of local buyers that have one lead or limits per hour, per day, that could lock up that scenario and that partner's only availability for that full time, because they have that valid ping in this scenario match. So those are two things to consider with the max delay. But if you do want to extend that beyond the 5-minute default, just open a support ticket and we can get that changed.
And I know I'm stating the obvious, but that's a setting you can go back into any source after you create it and adjust that. It's not just
Exactly,
something
yeah.
in Wizard
These
that
can
you
be
can touch.
delayed. Mm-hmm.
So,
Absolutely. So that's actually going to bring into some of our use cases here. What you see in this wizard, which is the minimum profit margin. What we will be adding to the next release in the source wizard, but you can also, to Michael's point, edit these settings, is the ignore profit margin. Now, the ignore profit margin is typically used for internal sources because presumably you want to sell a lead and don't have to maintain some minimum margin. But when you do utilize this setting, this would allow a lead to be processed even if the margin was not maintained. You would lead to less post rejects, but it does bring up a possibility of potentially selling a lead for a loss, especially if you're using fake ping price or some other more advanced features. Because take fake ping price as an example, you could calculate that fake ping price to be higher, and so your margins then would be based off of it. So typically the takeaway here is ignore profit margin is only used with internal sources that you're setting up, but there may be some cases where third-party leads that you're buying, maybe through standard mode on a direct post was the traditional example. So the next option that we want to talk about when we're talking about the ignore functions when it comes to the ping post consent is the ignore exclusivity. So in ignore, when you're using the ping post consent API, there may be cases where you want all of the bids and not just the best scenario returned to that ping response. So there is a function you can include ignore exclusivity, very similar to any other field like match with partner ID or a unique identifier. So you can include that in the string. The system then will return all bids to that ping and not just the best scenario. So you can see there's probably multiple use cases. There may be cases where you want to display more than just one scenario to a partner. We've seen this come in when clients have on their form presented two exclusive buyers to the consumer and then use that second exclusive buyer only in the case of a post reject. So the full flow there is, I'll go over to a website example which may make a little bit more sense.
Scott, while you're loading that up, do we have any written examples of those exact fields?
Could you say that again, Jake?
Yeah, I'm asking if we have any written documentation for those particular fields, just like the exact wording of that field, so that if they want to include it in the specs or in the posts, they can,
Sure. So they are not in the specs because they are not typically something you would share with, say, a third-party vendor. So they are more specific use cases. If you have the use case for, or you think you might, that's where we can communicate with you on an individual support ticket, make sure that that you're displaying it only in those cases that you want. You really wouldn't want a third-party vendor, for example, to use that, and there are some configuration options to go through. But in terms of the use case, if we assume that gray roofing and roof roofing are both exclusive buyers. They could presumably be presented on a custom form to the consumer. If the consumer selects both of them, then the system would maintain exclusivity on the post. And so it would post to gray roofing and only use roof roofing in the case that gray post rejected that lead. That's certainly one option and one way that we see people are handling that. The other way we'll take a look at is through the traditional post reject process, where you're presenting an exclusive and then only presenting roof roofing in the case of a post reject. But ultimately, it really depends on your vertical and how much post rejecting that you're dealing with. Ideally, you would go to buyers or try to reduce post rejects for those buyers by finding out why so many of them are getting post rejected. But if this is a case where gray is rejecting 10% of the leads, well, you're presenting roof roofing to that consumer, and they're not going to get 90% of them that are selected. On the other hand, if gray roofing post rejects 50, 60% of the leads, well, then this flow makes a lot more sense, because you can't really take the risk and drop off in a post reject scenario. So that again is the exclusivity. The next thing that we are going to cover in terms of ignore is one of the core foundations of the Ping Post Consent API, which is the match with bid ID. So in the match with bid ID, and everybody probably knows now, that's used to indicate what the consumer selected, which specific sellers. But when you are running your own leads to your own landing pages, you may encounter situations where there is no match with bid ID because the consumer doesn't select a matching selling company, or doesn't select any that are available to them. But in any case, you want to collect that lead in the system, which presumably would go unmatched. And you do not want to convert that lead to the standard Ping Post lead API. Because that consumer has given no consent, you don't want to open up that lead to reprocessing or any of those traditional rules followed by standard Ping Post lead APIs. And so you can use the ignore match with bid ID on the post, and then the system will accept the lead in, presumably there is no consent, right? So the lead is going to go unmatched. The lead comes in still on the Ping Post Consent API. But that way, if you're collecting consent for your own brand, or you want to remarket to them after the fact, this is another way to get that lead into the system when the consumer has not selected any selling companies. Okay, so we're going to go on to fake ping price. So when we look at the lead system, bear with me a sec. Oops. Fake ping price is something that some clients may have enabled. It's used to manipulate the bid. And this is something that we have the option if this is enabled in your filter sets here. So some warning. So the old or the traditional use case did have a valid or a use case for using a absolute or a fixed value for the ping price setup. But when we look at the world of dynamic and one-to-one consent, we would strongly, number one, encourage you to use it as a percent. That's going to allow that fake ping price to be maintained relatively as prices change, which is something that's happening a lot. Number two is the fake ping price, when it is enabled, will be used both for sorting and the bid calculation, returned back to the vendor. So by default, when it's enabled, it's used for both sorting and bid calculation. But we do have cases where we can change the system configuration so that this fake price is only used for sorting for the ping post lead and the ping post consent API. And then it would not be used for the cost calculations for either. And so that is something that can be changed. Typically, if you are only running internal traffic and are not dealing with any third-party vendors, then it would be the only use case that you would look at having us disable that fake ping price so that it's only used for sorting and not for cost. Okay. So guys, we're going to move on to the custom deliveries. I know there's lots of questions around that. I'll share my screen, go into the delivery wizard there. The one-to-one consent testing process is actually really bringing things full circle to way back in the early 2000s and how custom deliveries were set up and tested then. That flow has kind of morphed as systems became more standardized and people became more familiar, but with one-to-one consent and the need to actually see that matching selling company being returned, that is bringing us back to the traditional testing process. And so that testing process, to be summed up, is really you use the delivery and their specs to test the tech, to map, and to get the framework, but you have to test in live mode or in some live mode so that you can physically see what is being returned in a live environment in those different use cases, depending on the type of partner that you're setting up. And so, things move quickly. The delivery wizard does not have that full interface for handling that response back. We can hack the wizard to grab one, but it doesn't encounter if there's multiple sellers. So when we're looking at the delivery wizard here, the match with bid ID so as we look at a boberdoo to boberdoo delivery, this hardcode PHP parse response then is set up to look in the response for price and the selling company, and then return that in the dynamic, the ping post consent API response, or in the form itself. And so what we are seeing is that different systems essentially have different coding that needs to be placed into this hard code PHP response. And Jake, I know you've been working with the team a little bit on trying to organize this, but just like Boberdoo, right? Everybody's building things. Systems are still having changes in their responses, even as of today, for example. So do we have anything that can help our clients a little?
Yeah, it's really important to call out that some groups that we're integrating with are still figuring out their one-to-one consent solutions. So that means sometimes they're changing and we're keeping on the ball with that. But we are creating resources for deliveries that we've worked on and the responses we do get from those partners. So if you are working on your own custom delivery wizards and want a little bit of assistance on that, we do have a small repository of these responses and how they're coded in the delivery wizard that you can feed off of. So if you are working on those, reach out to open a ticket with your Boberdoo representative and we can share that information with you. I think it's also important to call out, Scott, you alluded to this earlier, with testing the delivery wizard, and some things that I'm seeing with other groups, is it's important to call out the delivery wizard works in isolation. It doesn't interact with that match with bid ID, and it doesn't work with any other custom processing you might have in your system. For example, maybe you have some custom logic that takes that phone for your lead and splits it up into like an area code, it's different pieces. Processing doesn't fire for the delivery wizard, so it's important to set those values in your test lead exactly like you would expect them to be for your normal leads when you're sending that data.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of continue on that process, what our team does to talk out is that they build the tech, right? The mapping, the base response, right? Any hard-coded fields, and then the mapping to get the tech, right? To make sure that the ping response works. And then they're even, in the case of multiple ones, will code this to look at the first response, just so that it can proceed to the next phase of testing. And so you'll see we will often keep our deliveries in mode of test until that's done. But if we look at a delivery here, this is the ping, and we are getting the bid. We are getting a price, we're getting a bid ID, and so the team then set up a price to post, but not a match with bid ID. So this is what Jake was talking about, where like the delivery wizard falls short. However, in the test mode, if you saw in that, we've coded it so that we will grab the first bid and return that so that the post is successful. But it's only done in the test mode because we don't want this delivery going live and only looking at one partner or one company in the response if and when this company is returning multiple sellers. So this is, again, coded just to look and get a test on the post, but it does represent a significant risk in that if somebody were to just go and assign this delivery, it is going to only ever grab the first partner. And so it's a very hard thing to know until there's a reason. So it's a very risky test process. And that is why we say, test the tech in the delivery wizard and then move to a live environment for testing. So a live environment for testing can take many forms. The most common thing we see is a client that has a test partner in their system. That test partner then can have credit limits and filter sets with small daily limits set up, no sources selected or only a test source selected. And then in that filter set, you can simply assign whatever delivery that you're testing for at that time. And then moving to the live environment. So that is where we think setting up a dynamic form is probably the fastest and easiest way to test it, because if you already have one set up, or even if you go through, we'll take a look at that, you can use the preview button and go through a quick form and again see firsthand what company or companies are being displayed to the consumer. And so if that's lining up, or if there's problems, that's a great quick way. It's submitting that ping into your system, and then that allows you to also scale your testing, because once that delivery has been tested out, right, you can then go back to the test partner's filter set, and all you are doing, one is activating or not activating a filter set, and then assigning or changing this delivery. So if you're ready to test the next partner, you can then just select the next delivery in question and go through the same flow from the preview option here. Now, of course, if you have a custom form, we have a lot of clients that want to set up a flow all the way through. In those cases, you have to think more about controlling that testing account with things like state and zip code combinations, thinking back to the old testing days of state of Alaska and zip of 9999. All right. So that actually will bring us to the form builder. So with the form builder, there's dynamic consent options for the type, and that is going to use that ping post consent API and flow. But there's also the standard. So that is going to use the ping post lead API and follow the traditional flow. So you can set up both. And there's actually, some interesting use cases to still use a standard flow. For example, if you're dealing with redirects in home improvement, where there is no consent being done, you can still use a standard flow. And as long as your buyer has a redirect URL in that custom delivery, that would then automatically grab and redirect the consumer to that URL. So I'm going to bounce a little bit around in our form builder here just to point out, first and foremost, trusted form. So the trusted form can be simply enabled with a switch here. Janaya, on the other hand, does have to have your code and key inputted. And then I'm going to come back and cover Google Tag Manager and Places here in a second. I bring up this trusted form because this will often work in conjunction with outside services, but if you're capturing that trusted form, presumably your buyers would be going through something similar when they are claiming that on their end. When we look at the trusted form, outside service 4.0 integration, this specifically is looking on the post, and we have the one-to-one tags, so that you can presumably only allow those that have one-to-one and success true. This is based off of making the call to trusted form and the response, the one-to-one verify response. And then the insights, when we select insights here, you'll see it will populate additional values. So this is going to be dependent on your individual account with trusted form. But then you can also post reject either leads that fall outside of these parameters or that have certain types of input. A word of caution and warning here when you're now dealing with one-to-one consent, as we'll take a look at, there are more cases where the consumer may get passed from form to form or from one form to another, redirected, and have pre-populated fields. And so if you do have very strict typing rules in here, you may want to reconsider that for those one-to-one use cases. But ultimately here, you can then set up this one-to-one based off of what accounts that you have at trusted form. Or if you're just passing that trusted form along, you don't even have to set up the outside services at all. So when we look at the form builder, I want to talk a sec about pre-pop options. So you can pass any fields in the URL parameters of the form. So what will be populated here will be specific to the lead type. These are the only ones for this demo lead type that we have set up. So if you are manually building them, you can do that utilizing these fields. But we do have a quick link in the form builder here. So creating a link can be used. Primary use cases here is going to be the destination URL of the ad campaign. So for example, if you're building a Google ad for your landing page, and you're going to run a search campaign, you can then use this create link to build that destination URL. So any field in your system, internal or external, would be here. So presumably, if you have UTMs, you're adding them in here, and they will be automatically populated down here at the bottom. So you can then grab this, place that in the destination URL of your Google ad. Another use case is, let's say you're dealing with affiliates. So we'll look at firing pixels for affiliates is something that's going to is more common with boberdoo clients now, given that they're driving more traffic to their own web properties. And pixels traditionally sat on the thank you page, but with a lead, and there's maybe a lot of reasons why it would not sell. And so rather than having that reside on the thank you page, that pixel can be moved to Boberdoo and then fire on a server-to-server pixel through a webhook. So in those cases, maybe you're setting up an Everflow offer or something like that. You can then use this to build the offer link in the system that Everflow would then use. So you can then populate whatever the appropriate fields are for that as well. So really easy way to get those pre-populated URL parameters into a link. That can help a lot when you're talking about passing a lead from either one form to another, or if you're dealing with any vendors maybe that don't have the ability to do one-to-one, you could even have them pass over any leads after a standard lead submission. So the next thing that we will take a look at here is the post-reject second chance text. So post-reject second chance is something that has to be enabled in your system. So if you do not, or if you're not sure, please open a support ticket. We can either enable it or let you know. But the idea there is the primary, the best scenario, that the consumer consented to post rejects that lead for one reason or another. In the boberdoo flow in the forms, we have text, so you can present that to the consumer, and then it will give the consumer the next best match. This is also something that is returned in the response if you're using the API. But from a user experience, you can then manipulate this text to try and convince the consumer to submit, to click submit again, or to click I agree again. While we are in here, for those of you that's followed Troutman, they have changed their tune a bit on select all and pre-select, saying that you can do it in certain situations, but that functionality does exist in the boberdoo system, and it does present some text option for you so that you can make sure that you are clearly stating the options to the consumer. That was one of the big parts of that Troutman name in 15. Same thing with the pre-select or not. Those can be handled independently. So again, we would encourage you to ask your legal team, but these options do exist, and as given that you can really quickly and easily get a form on built, it's a good opportunity to test what are the effects of those. So the next thing we want to talk a little bit about is the magic strings, mostly focusing on the exclusive match. But when you have no matches for a ping, do you have specific text? We see a lot of people then maybe that are going to try and get some sort of language related to their brand or the website brand. And so the magic strings in here only relate to the lead because there are no companies, because there are no matches. When we look at the TCPA text for an exclusive match, you will see partner phone and partner company name, along with the lead email and phone. This is very important to include once and only once in the exclusive match. Presumably, you're going to show that consistent language to everybody, to all the consumers, and then this would dynamically populate the field with the seller company information following that hierarchy. And that hierarchy being looking at the custom delivery first, then looking at the consent settings in the partner account, and then lastly looking at the company information only if the previous two do not contain anything. And then including it once is very important when it comes to the trusted form verify, because if that company name is included more than once, it does affect the tagging of that seller information. And then a non-exclusive match, again, only has lead fields because you do not have the dynamic matches in here, but instead are presenting those shared or non-exclusive scenario to the consumer so that they can select it. And in that case, typically, you're going to have a more generic text language that you're putting in here. So that brings us to the thank you page. So first and foremost, if the partner's delivery is returning a redirect or iframe, we're typically talking about the Angie Modernize networks and home use cases here. If that is returned in the delivery, we will automatically redirect. There's no settings that are needed, and it will override whatever you have put here. So this is what is used in the case of no redirect. These are kind of the two to talk a little bit about. So when there are no matches on the ping thank you page, we have some clients that are just going to turn around and sell that as a click right now. But you can continue on to the form, and it will then allow you to proceed and continue collecting that lead. The use case of redirecting them to a URL, we've had lots of clients even redirecting them maybe to their own URL or a different offer page or something related. So you can even set up some workarounds for conditional fields utilizing some of these options here. And so if you do have kind of those more use cases, those more nuanced use cases, please let us know. We'll be happy to work through that with you. Continuing with the form, obviously, then is going to bring them to the last page where their PII sits. And then we have the no matches on thank you page. So what happens if your lead is post-rejected by all of your buyers or fails your outside services or lead QC? Or there's no matches, right? They're coming from Alaska at 1 o'clock in the morning. You don't have any buyers. This option here allows you to submit the lead as a standard ping post lead API. Presumably that lead then goes unmatched, but you might be able to work or reprocess that lead down the road. And so there are those use cases where you can do that to still collect that lead into the system. And then, of course, you can submit text and present them any language if you want them to resubmit the form. So I'm going to bounce over to Andrea's system for the third-party scripts because we do have some advanced options. So you've all seen the Google Tag Manager. We've had several cases where you may have other scripts or things to put onto your forms or landing pages. We do have a custom script that can be enabled. This is read-only for boberdoo clients, but we can insert code into the system and a review and upload process, since it is the ability literally to load anything in there. The other advanced feature that we can build into the system is the Google Places. There is back and forth. It's not a plug and play. There are API keys that you would have to get for your account. It takes a couple hours, but we can work with you and get those Google Places enabled so that you would have a more advanced option for submitting address if that is on your forms. And so then lastly, when we get into the nitty-gritty of the system, is that if you're in the form builder, your view looks a little different than mine. You start at contact fields and do not see the internal fields here. That's primarily just from a user experience because not many have traditionally had to edit these. But if you do have use cases where you need these to be edited, this is something that Boberdoo can do, super admins can do, or we can simply reclassify an internal field to others so that they are exposed and you can then handle them here. So there are multiple options if you are dealing with fields that are in an internal field, but you want to handle them on the form. We have a couple ways to do that. And then just lastly, like visible on form, these options can get a little confusing. admittedly, because of the different combinations of visible versus it being required and not required. And then also taking the additional step of editing that field itself, whether making it a hidden field that you default to a specific value. So I could have, that value submitted on every DOB if I wanted, or making it just hidden and not required. The other option, of course, is changing that field name so that it appears more consumer-friendly facing fields as opposed to the CSV field names. So all of that can then be used to manipulate your front-end form. All right. Okay, so I think this is a good spot to come to a break here. We have a little time for questions to see if there's any that have been asked along the way.
We've not seen any questions submitted on the chat from anyone at this stage, so I'm wondering if maybe the chat feature is hidden from the.
Now we just get all the questions ahead of it.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, I would say we have some that we did not get through on this one that we will be picking up on our Monday webinar. And one of those would be, well, if there are no questions, I can cover it in this last part. So we talked a lot about passing a consumer from one form to another. And so you may be dealing with vendors that have their own custom forms and have not been able to convert their form to the ping post consent API, or other use cases where you want to essentially jump the consumer to the end of the flow. And so that is where we have an option in the forms to use ping submit equals true. So if we look into this browser, we can see at the end we've appended it with ping submit equals true. So the idea is you're collecting some information on another form, and then instead of submitting that lead into Boberdoo, you want to put them to the last page of and present those matches to the consumer so that they can provide consent. And so instead of posting a lead in after the submit button, you would redirect them essentially to a URL very similar to what you're seeing here, so that they can see their information that they've already collected and then simply select whichever ones they want. If this is an exclusive use case, right, then that would be the seller company name would be dynamically inserted into the TCPA language. There would be no checkboxes. But the idea here then again is you can jump them to this final page and click I agree. So we've seen this come up in several different use cases. The one I mentioned about a vendor. Another one is if you're dealing with calls, so you could use this to get consent if you're on a call and, hey, I'm going to send you a link. You could shorten this URL, send it as a text message so that you get consent with somebody that you're on the phone with. So there's a lot of use cases for this and ping submit equals true. If we go back to our webinar example here, this is kind of that affiliate use case that I mentioned. That redirects to this example. And then based on what you choose here, that would then jump you to the ping submit equals true. And now we see instead of those multiple sellers, this new ping request has a dynamic one. The consumer can click, then I agree. And then, of course, this is a boberdoo form, so you can control what fields are on here. We're just doing this for example, but you could presumably just have the phone field on here if that's all that you wanted.
Scott, we have a question from Anthony, if you would want to switch gears. The question reads, do we have to use that PHP code for every custom delivery we create?
Yes. You have to use some PHP code to grab, the price and the selling company or whatever that individual posting specs are equivalent.
Scott, just want to clarify one thing. That custom PHP code, you hear me all right?
Yep.
Cool. That custom PHP code that you were showing off to parse the response is specific for usually brokers that have their own bids that they are returning to boberdoo. So we're thinking groups like Modernize, like Networks, like Angie's List. For groups that are just retail partners that are just taking your insurance lead and using it and returning their own bid, you may not or likely don't have to have any sort of custom parsing in there.
Correct.
But you do also have to have custom parsing for boberdoo to boberdoo. Is one of the common ones that we see. So to answer your question, not all of them, just the ones that are brokers that return their own bids, kind of like boberdoo does.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. That's exactly right. Only those that would have the dynamic return. And then that is the code that we showed was boberdoo to boberdoo specific. So that's where Jake has some internal documentation that he can share with you if you would just open the ticket and request it, and we will share it with you. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I'm sure we'll all be working hard over the next couple of days. So any questions that come up, we also will be having another webinar on Monday, day of, cover some last minute use cases, testing, but also any questions that come up once the rubber hits the road. Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.